Hi. Today's story is about my first time in Lake Nona, Orlando, facing Margaret's iron fist over my lawn. The revelation of her toxic land secret causes a scandal, toppling her reign over this sunny, shady suburb. Don't forget to subscribe and like the channel. Here we go.
I never imagined that moving to Orlando, the sunny city of dreams with palm trees and endless summer, would turn into a nightmare. My new home in Lake Nona promised peace. Neat lawns, white picket fences, kids on bikes. But on the very first day, I caught the guy across the street, a grizzled man with a hawk-like stare, measuring my grass with a ruler. That was my first hint that the HOA, Homeowners Association. Here wasn't just a formality. A week later, a letter showed up in my mailbox, a $50 fine for improper grass height. I laughed it off, thinking it was a joke, and tossed it. Big mistake. The letters kept coming. At first, they were polite, then threatening, hints of lawsuits and even home forfeiture. I started noticing neighbors giving me sidelong glances, like I'd broken some sacred code. One night, driving back from work, I saw my lawn had been mowed, perfectly, down to the millimeter. No joy in that, though. Someone had trespassed. The next morning, a note was under my door. "Watch yourself, newbie." No signature. My laughter turned to cold sweat. I decided to dig in. The HOA website listed the chair, Margaret Crow, a woman with a reputation as Lake Nona's Iron Lady. Her house, a 2-story mansion with columns, sat at the end of the street like a throne. I emailed her asking what was going on, but got no reply. Instead, the next day, my trash can was tipped over, its contents strewn across the road. This wasn't random anymore. Someone in this picture-perfect neighborhood had declared war on me, and I sensed the grass was just an excuse. I couldn't sleep that night, staring out the window. Streetlights lit empty roads, but shadows moved. Someone was watching. Backing down wasn't an option. This was my home, my life. The plan formed itself. I'd find Margaret's weak spot, and her cronies too. Everyone has secrets, even in Lake Nona. I was going to unearth them. Morning in Orlando hit with its usual heat, but I felt a chill. I stood by my trash can, picking up scattered bags while the neighbor with perfectly styled hair walked by, pretending I didn't exist. That silent disdain was becoming routine. I knew the HOA was behind it all, with Margaret Crow as their queen. I needed to figure out who she was, so I started digging. I began with a casual stroll through the neighborhood, acting like I was just out for a walk. Lake Nona gleamed, sparkling pools, sweet-smelling flowers lining the streets, but beneath the polish there was tension. People avoided my eyes, and an old man watering roses glanced at my house and shook his head. They knew something I didn't. At Margaret's place, I lingered. Blinds shut tight. A black sedan with tinted windows parked in the driveway. Someone was inside, but they didn't come out. That night, I hit the internet. Margaret's name popped up in old articles. She'd moved to Orlando a decade ago after some scandal in Jacksonville. Details were scarce, just whispers of financial disputes. Intriguing. Her social media was spotless. Charity dinner photos, smiles, nothing personal. But in the comments, an anonymous post caught my eye. "She's not who she pretends to be." That hooked me. I kept searching. The next day, something odd happened. My mailbox was empty, first time in a week. Instead, an unmarked envelope sat on my porch. Inside was a photo of my house, taken at night, with a red X on the door. My heart raced. This wasn't a prank anymore. I scanned the street. Quiet, but a shadow flickered around the corner. Someone was playing with me, and I had a gut feeling Margaret knew more than she let on. I needed an ally, but in Lake Nona, everyone seemed like her pawn. Or were they? The Orlando sun blazed down, but I felt a shiver. That photo with the X sat on my table like a ticking bomb. Calling the cops wasn't an option. No proof, just paranoia. But I knew I was being watched, and that certainty drove me forward. I had to find a crack in the HOA's wall, and I was ready to take a risk. I started watching the neighbors. Across the street lived a guy in his 30s, skinny, with a neck tattoo, not your typical Lake Nona resident. He rarely came out, but sometimes smoked in his backyard, staring off into the distance. His lawn was just shy of perfect, and that gave me hope. One evening I saw him taking out the trash and edged closer. His look was wary, not hostile. I didn't say a word, just nodded. He nodded back. It was the first hint of a connection. The next day, I took a chance. That morning, when Margaret left her house, I watched her sedan peel onto the highway. I walked by his place and slipped a note in his mailbox. Need to talk, not with her. By evening, he showed up at my fence, silently handing me a beer. We sat in my backyard, and I learned his name was Dan. He hated the HOA as much as I did. Margaret had once fined him for an inappropriate motorcycle in his garage, and he'd held a grudge ever since. Dan spilled that Margaret ran the neighborhood like a dictator. She collected fines that didn't all go to upkeep, and some residents feared her to their core. He hinted she kept a black book, a list of violations and dirt on everyone in Lake Nona. If that was real, I had a shot. But Dan warned me she wasn't alone. Someone helped her, someone dangerous. That night I heard a noise outside. A car with no plates cruised by slowly. The stakes were rising, and I knew there was no turning back. Orlando bathed in evening light, but to me, it was a city of shadows. After meeting Dan, I realized Margaret wasn't just a nitpicking old lady. Her power rested on fear and secrets, and that black book sounded like the key. I decided to tail her, figure out where she went besides her throne at the street's end. Dan agreed to help, but kept his distance. He was clearly scared. I started small. In the morning, I parked a block from her house and watched. She stepped out in a sharp suit, got in her sedan, and drove off. I followed, staying back. She led me to a run-down office building on the edge of Lake Nona, peeling paint, nothing fancy. She went in, then emerged an hour later with a man in dark sunglasses. Tall, hard-faced, he moved like he was used to giving orders. They drove off together, leaving me with more questions. That night I met Dan again. He went pale when I described the guy. It was Rick, an ex-cop fired for shady dealings. Word was, he now worked for Margaret, collecting debts and keeping troublemakers in line. So the trashed cans and the X photo, Rick's doing. But why me? My lawn wasn't worth this hassle. Then I remembered the Jacksonville article. Financial schemes. What if Margaret was hiding something bigger and I'd stumbled into her crosshairs? I took a reckless step that night. While the neighborhood slept, I crept to her house. The windows were dark, but the garage glowed. I peeked through a crack. A box of papers sat there, topped with an envelope labeled LN17. My lot number. My pulse pounded. They knew something about me or the house. I backed off but tripped over a hose. The noise echoed in the silence and a light flicked on inside. I ran, heart in my throat. Orlando's morning buzzed with lawnmowers, but I couldn't relax. Last night's trip to Margaret's left marks, bruises from the fall and a racing mind. LN17 stuck with me. My lot. What was so special about it? I dug into the house paperwork from the sale. It seemed normal. Contract, blueprints, ownership history. But one thing stood out. The house had 3 owners in 5 years. Why? I called the realtor who sold it to me. He was polite but dodged questions, saying past owners just moved on, then hung up fast. That fueled my suspicions. I went deeper, hitting Orlando's archives. In the library, I found old Lake Nona records. The area was built over a former warehouse site, with a fire in the 90s. Nothing shady, but one article mentioned the land tied back to a Jacksonville company. Coincidence? I doubted it. Dan waited at his place. I shared my finds, and he frowned. He recalled rumors. An old-timer said Margaret bought her house dirt cheap when the neighborhood was new, then took over the HOA and tightened the screws. Maybe she was hiding something about the land. Or money? We decided to check her office. That night, we drove there with just a flashlight and nerves. The building was empty, the door unlocked. It smelled damp and folders sat on a desk, one with my address. I opened it and froze. Photos of my lot before the house was built, and beneath them, a soil analysis. Contamination. Bad stuff. Someone buried it before the sale, and Margaret knew. But why threaten me? It hit me. She feared I'd find out. Then I heard tires screech outside. Rick. We barely hid as the door swung open. The Orlando night was muggy, but I broke out in a cold sweat in that office. Rick stepped in, his boots thumping on the concrete. Dan pressed against the wall beside me, and we held our breath. Rick swept his flashlight over the desk where the folder had been minutes ago. I clutched it now, knowing it was my leverage or my doom. He muttered something and left, slamming the door. We waited until his car faded, then exhaled. By morning, I'd studied the papers. Toxic contamination on my lot. Chemical leftovers from the old warehouse. Someone faked the reports to sell the land, and Margaret was in on it. She used the HOA to keep everyone scared and quiet. I was the glitch, a newbie who didn't know the game. The fines, threats, Rick. It was all to push me out before I uncovered the truth. I struck first. I copied the docs and emailed them anonymously to every neighbor. Lake Nona erupted. People swarmed Margaret's house, demanding answers. She stepped onto her porch, pale but stone-faced. Rick loomed beside her, but even he couldn't stop the crowd. Someone yelled for the cops, and soon sirens cut the air. Margaret was cuffed. Rick vanished, leaving her to face it alone. A week later, I watched my grass grow wild again. No more fines came. Dan brought beer, and we sat quietly, watching the sunset. Lake Nona had shifted, not overnight, but the cracks in its perfection showed. I'd won, but I felt drained. Orlando stayed a city of sunshine, but for me, it'd always be where truth outweighed a tidy lawn.